anything like I was when I was a kid, you made your parents sit and watch movies with you all the time. And if you're anything like my parents, then you probably found out early on that you'd rather watch all 14 Air Bud movies and their corresponding spin-offs than JJ Jet Plane for the 100th time this month. But while kid me was absolutely ecstatic, as I've grown up and learned more about the industry and decided to pay attention to film credits instead of just begging my mom to go outside so I could get more popcorn, I've encountered the following seal of approval at the end of quite a few movies. No animals were harmed in the making of this film. From the good old American Humane Association. There's just one problem. How do we know they're telling the truth? See, animals acting in movies and other forms of entertainment clearly isn't anything new. What is new is the American Humane Association's seal of approval. Created all the way back more than 100 years ago in 1877, the American Humane Association, well, okay, they didn't add the association part until 1878, but if you want to be pedantic, go watch CinemaSins. Formed in 1877, the American Humane Association was created to ensure the safety, welfare, and well-being of animals. Sounds alright so far, doesn't it? But movies didn't exist back then, so what were they doing? Farm animals. Okay, that sounds wrong. I don't mean they were doing farm animals. I mean their focus was on them. See, the AHA formed out of an amalgamation of a bunch of other groups from all across the USA and even Canada too, for some reason. But when they started, they didn't even really have any aspirations for ensuring films and television treated animals fairly at all. And to be fair, I don't really blame them. In 1877, this was the closest thing we had to a movie. Is this horse a paid actor? Is he? Is he? Yes, actually, she is. Her name is Sally Gardner, and she never acted again, and honestly, I see why. Perfect. This short film, if you'd like to call it that, is actually pretty important for film history as a whole. See, we know that this is Sally Gardner, the horse, and a guy called Dom was riding her. We don't actually know who's riding this other horse in a movie that looks strikingly similar. But anyway, we're getting slightly off topic. The Humane Society was formed to protect the welfare and safety of farm animals, which certainly seems like a moral thing to do. But it wasn't until the full 63 years later that they would actually begin their work in films. And needless to say, films hadn't been waiting around for the go-ahead to use animals in their productions. Before movies became as mainstream as they were, one of the largest proprietors of the general public's free time was the circus. Rather than go see a movie, the general public went and saw animals and people do tricks and display other strange talents, all for the amusement and fun of performing. I mean, there was also the deeply rooted racist and xenophobic societal pressures that forced minorities and those with disabilities into these positions. That's a larger discussion for another day and someone much more qualified. I'm talking about the animals and the movies, baby. Now, before I go any further, I want to say that I will be trying my best not to show anything that's too graphic or unsettling. I'll be showing some stills and describing what happened. That being said, if you're concerned with seeing any animal malpractice or cruelty, just listen to the audio on this. It'll still make sense. Anyway, back to the circus. In the late 1800s, seeking to find new ways to enhance his circus and create more attractions to draw in the general public, Adam Forepaugh, a horse trainer and circus handler, smuggled a baby elephant into the country, who he would later name Topsy. Circuses at this time did have their critics. Rather than it being the AHA to step in and to question the ethics and livelihoods of these animals and the conditions they were being subjected to, it was instead the ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Circuses at this time were not known for their standards of care. Animals and performers were often on the road for days at a time, traveling from city to city to perform. Animals were often transported in incredibly small cages where they were wallowing in their own waste. Infections and deaths from bacteria and other infections was common. The years went on. Topsy the elephant was systematically used for a bulk of performances. All of that brings us to 1902, where in the early morning hours of the circus, Topsy would retaliate in a way that would ultimately begin to signal the road that led to her death just a short 6 months later. In Brooklyn, New York, for a show, a spectator by the names of James Fielding Blount broke away from the rest of the circus and snuck his way into the area where all of the elephants and other animals were held. He came up towards the elephants and began to agitate them, doing things such as feeding them whiskey and other potentially harmful substances, kicking up sand into their face, and finally stubbing out a cigarette on Topsy's trunk. While large creatures, elephants are almost the epitome of a gentle giant.
The elephant's trunk contains more than 100,000 muscle units.
Their trunks are very sensitive and their backs can't hold nearly as much weight comfortably like they may appear to be able to, and it's one of the reasons many places are beginning to ban or cry for a boycott against companies that engage in this practice of elephant riding. In the short few moments after Blount stubbed his cigarette out on Topsy's trunk, it's reported that she grabbed Blount with her trunk and threw him to the ground, before proceeding to bludgeon him with either her head, feet, knees, or some other combination of the three. He did not survive. This was not the first time Topsy had fought against her abuse and someone died as a result of it, but rather than changing their practices to ensure it didn't happen again, the circus instead ran with the story to increase publicity, claiming that Topsy the man killer had killed 12 people, a fact which has since been heavily disputed, as records show that Topsy killed at most 1 to 3 other people who were all members of the circus and directly responsible for the conditions of her treatment. In June of 1902, just 1 month after the killing of Blount, Topsy was responsible for the injury of another spectator who goaded her by tickling behind her ears, and the owners of the Forepaw and Cell Circus decided their best course of action was to sell the elephant and move on to other attractions. After changing hands a few times, Topsy eventually landed in the hands of the owners of Luna Park, where she was continuously forced to do manual labor like pulling heavy pieces of machinery in what the media called penance for her actions. On one fated day in 1902, where Topsy was refusing to cooperate with the circus's demands, her drunk handler attempted to force her to continue by mutilating her with a pitchfork. When a police officer came over to investigate the incident, it's reported that her handler instead set her free to run amok across the city. This animal, who had known nothing but captivity, abuse, and mistreatment, was probably running for her life, terrified of what was happening to her around this strange place. Only a few months later, her handler would force Topsy into yet another stunt similar to this, but this time attempted to ride and force the animal into a police station, an event which ultimately led to his firing. After the firing of her handler, the owners at Luna Park found her completely uncooperative to their commands and looked for a way to sell her off to another circus. But when they found nobody would take her, they perceived they had no other choice but to euthanize the animal, a term I use with very heavy quotation marks for reasons you'll see in a moment. The park owners began to concoct a way to kill the elephant. The original plan was not to simply lull the elephant into some sort of a sleep and then euthanize her, but instead originally planned to be a public execution of the animal by hanging, where viewers could pay to see it. They were making the animal's death just another attraction and all part of the spectacle of the circus. At the notice of this in the press release, the president of the ASPCA decided to step in and said that hanging was a needlessly cruel way of euthanizing the animal, and he also completely rejected the idea of using it as a prop. The owners of the circus negotiated heavily with the president of the ASPCA until finally a part poisoning and part electrical shock execution was decided on. At no point did they ever consider taking the animal back to Southeast Asia where it was originally from. On January 4th, 1903, the owners of Luna Park led Topsy to her death. Perhaps sensing what was happening, the animal refused to go past a certain point. The park tried for several hours to get Topsy to cross a bridge, but eventually decided to re-rig the electricity wiring to where she stood instead. Topsy then had 6,000 volts of electricity shot into her body. Her body begins to smoke as the electricity courses through her, and she eventually falls to the ground, dead. The worst part about all of this is that nobody thought it was a horrid thing to do, and nobody objected even to letting the Edison Company film and let over 100 people watch. Topsy's death should have marked the beginning of much stricter guidelines in terms of animal welfare, immediately. But it took until 1940 for the American Humane Society to begin boycotting films that featured animal abuse. The first film to garner a large amount of attention for the abuse of animals was the 1940 Western movie Jesse James, in which a horse was made to run off of a cliff where the horse didn't even die on impact, but instead only broke its back and had to be put down in another way soon after. But this was far from the first time horses were being exploited and abused in films. In fact, horses were by far the most often used animal in films at this time due to the popularity of westerns and the stunts required by the animals. Nowadays, we've got a better understanding of how to train animals to do these complex stunts and to do it as safely as possible, but for a long while, animals weren't treated as anything more than tools or property for a film company to use in any way that the filmmakers saw fit. Currently, if you want to have a scene where something looks like it's tripping the horse and it falls down, you can train it to fall in a way that doesn't injure its legs, thus taking the brunt of the fall onto the more meaty and stable part of the horse's body. But back then, due to the lack of any real supervision of animals on sets and their use in films, it was instead much more common to use a tripwire to force horses to trip over themselves. This often resulted in the animals having to be put down during or after shooting if the film was complete, because they would break vital bones in their leg. See, to you, me, and basically any other human near a hospital, breaking a leg is annoying and painful, but there's basically no chance you're gonna die from it. But the anatomy of horses is different. Their bones have to be strong enough to support their weight, but they also have to be light enough to carry them at high speeds. This combination oftentimes make a broken leg prove to be basically impossible to repair, because rather than a simple fracturing of the bone, instead the whole bone effectively shatters or gets malformed in a way that makes healing impossible. The exploitation and danger for horses in movies was rampant for the first 40 years of the 19th century. In the 1926 movie Ben-Hur, it's reported that over 100 horses died during the filming, going to the movie that started the large boycotts by the AHA to improve the conditions of animal welfare on set, Jesse James. The movie blinded its horses and spooked them to make them run and charge completely off of a cliff with no idea what they were doing. After the 1936 movie Charge of the Light Brigade killed another 125 horses during production, and Jesse James followed it up in 1939, it was clear that the time to put a stop to the practices had officially come. The ASPCA had been steadily growing support to ban the practice of using tripwires, and in 1940 they were officially outlawed in the United States. I should note that it's not like every single movie that included horses used these devices. There were a few movie productions and members of Hollywood that were doing things ethically, at least for the time. For example, in 1924, during the filming for singer Jim McKee, the star of the film, William Hart, had a horse named Fritz, who he cared for deeply. Not wanting to risk the life of his own horse or a stunt horse, the crew instead concocted a body double switch from the real horse to a fake horse that was so believable people thought that the stunt was real, and it's not like they were lacking on evidence of the practice. Following 1940, the American Humane Association got big support from an unlikely figure, William Hayes. Now, if you're not a cinema nerd like me, that name probably doesn't mean a lot to you, but William Hayes was responsible for the aptly titled Hayes Code, a set of rules and guidelines which was imposed on film production to help them fit within the way that God and the church wanted films to be. The Hayes Code was infamous for the amount of restrictions it placed on films. While there are a couple on there that seem like no-brainers, such as no children's genitalia shown, or no depictions of actual hangings or electrocutions, like, the exact thing which had almost been public spectacle 40 years ago, most of these requirements ended up censoring a giant amount of filmmakers, split into two simplistically titled columns of don'ts and be carefuls. In the don'ts column, which was defined as things that should not appear in pictures produced by members of the association, irrespective of the manner they are treated, Hayes Code prohibited many things which are popular in films today. Any profanity or use of the words God, Lord, Jesus, Christ as a profane piece of language wasn't allowed.
Jesus fucking Christ.
Nudity was banned completely.
Are you a virgin?
Any marriage between two people of different races wasn't allowed.
Is it because I'm black?
The code also banned willful offense to any nation, creed, or race.
Okay, I'm confused.
So, needless to say, it was about as riddled with holes as a holy piece of Swiss cheese, and is exactly as you'd expect for a movie censorship at a time where 3 to 6 million people in the United States were part of the KKK.
I can't see fucking shit out of this thing.
The Hayes Code is also the reason we have the cliched trope of a perfect kiss with one foot popping up, because 2 feet off the ground spelled too much sex for the church to handle. On the be careful side of the Hayes Code, which stated that elements could be included provided special care was taken, it gets even more ridiculous, looking at it so many years later. Firearms had to be shown carefully.
Oh man, I shot Marvin in the face.
Theft, robbery, and safecracking and dynamiting of trains, a real specific one there, had to keep in mind the effect which a too detailed description of these might have upon the moron.
One of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
Rebellion, showing sympathy for criminals, a first night, one night stand kind of thing wasn't allowed, nor was showing a woman and man in bed together. No, I don't mean sex scenes, that's already been banned well before. I mean just a man and a woman in a bed together. But the most relevant Hayes Code item for this video essay is on the Be Carefuls list, the item titled Apparent Cruelty to Children or Animals. Working with the Motion Picture Association, the AHA began to have much more oversight on the care of animals working on set. Unfortunately, due to the fact that so much of this time for cinema was censored, lost, or stifled, finding any actual concrete evidence that the AHA made a meaningful impact on animal welfare in films is dubious at best. But going by the fact that they, along with the ASPCA, led to the banning of tripwires for horses in 1940, and from 1946 to 1955, nearly a third of all movies produced were still westerns, I think it's safe to say that they definitely were making at least some amount of a difference. Unfortunately, being tied to the Hayes Code also proved to be a double-edged sword when, in 1966, following the dissolving of the Hayes Code, so too was the AHA's jurisdiction to observe the welfare of animals on sets, and it was heavily diminished for another 14 years. It's also important to note that this was not the same type of power they have today, more on that later. In 1959, when the Hayes Code was fully established and the AHA was investigating animal welfare, the remake of the 1926 Ben-Hur movie led to another 100 horses dying during filming for various reasons. Maybe they should just, stop making movies about that dude. Unfortunately, over the next few decades, from 1966 when the AHA lost jurisdiction until 1980 when they got back some of that power, and when they established the official guidelines in 1988, animal abuse still continued to happen in many productions. And it wasn't just westerns either. Unfortunately, movies like Conan the Barbarian were allowed to get away with rampant abuse such as kicking a dog, a camel being struck, and unfortunately, even after 42 years, the use of tripping horses to fall into somersaults by use of tripwire. But I thought you said they banned the use of them in 1940. They did, but the AHA only has jurisdiction in the United States. During the filming of Conan the Barbarian, the president of the AHA sent a letter to the president of the Animal Welfare Branch in Spain, only to be told that, unfortunately, Spain's laws on animal actors and using animals in films were basically non-existent. But even movies back in the United States were still abusing animals. If your film was a low-budget indie production, the likelihood of having an AHA representative on set was slim, which leads me to one of the most heartbreaking examples of miscommunication and negligence leading to the death of an animal.
Friday the 13th, rated R.
Needing a snake for a scare, the crew approached a snake handler with a harmless bull snake named Iso. Unaware of what was to happen when filming started for the scene, the handler had to watch as an actor kills the snake by cutting it in half. Reports vary somewhat on the aftermath, but it's generally agreed upon that the handler didn't know the snake was going to die, and that Iso was their own personal pet snake. The effect could have easily been faked with some simple puppetry, or another solution could have been reached if the film would have made the intentions clear to the handler, but instead the animal died a painful, agonizing death in a B-rate horror slasher that could have been entirely avoided. This low-budget and foreign film way of getting around the cruelty of animals really came to head with the release of the 1980 film Cannibal Holocaust. During production, 7 animals died, but none of it was accidental. While many critics were outraged at the killings, which were partially more real-feeling due to the found footage style of filmmaking, some other institutions like the British Board of Film Classification ruled that the deaths were quick, painless, and that many of the meat and parts of the animals were going to indigenous members of the crew. However, on the flip side, so many actors on the film expressed doubts or disgust with the real animals dying that they were filming.
I said, are you actually going to kill this monkey?
The director of the film was far from a good person, and reportedly skimped on paying wages, pressured an actress into showing her breasts,
I didn't know if this was a snuff movie or not.
would shout or scream at crew members, and provided little sympathy for the actors that had a difficult time acting in scenes depicting sexual assault.
There was nobody telling anybody where to stop.
Cannibal Holocaust was also wrapped up in several other false claims after and during its theatrical release, such as one that said that the deaths of the humans on screen were real, which was completely fabricated. The dangers of using untrained animals on a film production, on the other hand, was also made infamous by the 1981 film Roar. The entire movie came to director and writer Noel Marshall and his wife when they were on tour in Mozambique. While filming another movie, they came across an abandoned house that had become a home for a pride of lions, and were told by their guide that they were in danger due to poaching. Upon the couple's return to Los Angeles, they began to keep tigers and other wild animals at their house, a practice which was illegal and which they had very little training for. After being discovered in 1972 by the authorities, they constructed a new place to house the creatures. The place was not up to code, nor were the animals' housing conditions. The husband and wife duo couldn't pay union workers the required amount, so they used untrained workers. If this is already sounding horrible, just wait, it unfortunately gets worse. By the time the crew started filming, they had over 150 large animals, and they were understaffed, underfunded, and underprepared. During production, the injuries were numerous. Noel was bitten through the hand and almost had to have his arm amputated. Even after his arm was saved, he was bit so many times that he contracted gangrene multiple times. His wife had her ankle fractured by an elephant, her skull scraped by a lion's tooth, and she almost lost an eye in a lioness attack. The cinematographer was scalped, 4 members of the sound crew had to be rescued from a flood, and many other injuries happened. After an on-again, off-again production schedule of over 10 years and over 100 injuries and 20 crew members quitting the film on one day, the film was officially set to be released. It was predicted to be a box office hit, grossing $125 million.
Few of you know of my passion in the 70s involving making an incredible film titled Roar.
At least it was if you asked Noel Marshall and his wife. Secretly, I think at this point they knew they were in way too deep over their head, and the money from Noel's work on The Exorcist had dried up years ago. Against a budget of $17 million, Roar's initial release garnered it $2 million. A colossal box office bomb. Critical reviews of the film when it came out were mixed to bad, with the praise for it being the only thing that arguably shouldn't have been praised at all. The the real-life danger that the untrained animals on set presented to the cast and crew. The film continued to float around in cult circles and had a re-release in 2015, 5 years after Noel Marshall had passed away, but it was a failure then as well, and a stark reminder of the dangers of using animals in films, especially those that can easily kill a person without proper animal handlers and safety precautions. Moving past 1980 marked a seeming up note for the American Humane Association. Partnering with the Screen Actors Guild meant that when the rules were changed, the AHA had to be contacted ahead of time for any use of animals on set. But this still hasn't solved many of the problems. While animal abuse is certainly lower in the 2000s and 2010s than it was in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there are still many scandals and technicalities that allow for animals to be abused. Many of this relies on the fact that the AHA has the final say on whether a film has treated its animals acceptably or not. It is the only organization with this sort of control. An article in the LA Times details movies that had used BB guns and shock collars to train horses that still got the AHA seal of approval, as well as some other moments of suspected internal cover-up, but unfortunately we can't know the entire story of what goes on behind closed doors, so take everything you read with a slight grain of salt. Still, even if you believe that the AHA does a good job, they're still only as good as the power that they have to enforce punishment, and the scope in which they can monitor animals. During the filming of the 2012 Hobbit movie, for example, it's reported that 27 animals died, and yet it still got the AHA seal of approval. The reason? All of the animals died outside of the set, and the AHA doesn't traditionally monitor where animals are being kept. Some reports of misconduct ultimately don't affect the movie's rating whether the AHA knows about it or not. In the 2012 movie Life of Pi, a tiger named King almost drowned, yet this incident was never reported outside of the AHA, and the public was unaware until an email chain was leaked about a year later, in which the AHA monitor says, "Last week, we almost f***ing killed King in the water tank," and goes on to say that she downplayed the f*** out of it. The more you dig into this organization and what it stands for, the more you find evidence against it, such as when a reporter tried to investigate the deaths of 2 horses on the film Flicka and called animal control only for them to be denied access by the AHA to the movie set. I believe that ultimately the AHA has done good and has improved the quality of animals' life on sets, but it's still disconcerting to see so many times that things seem to slip through the cracks. Regardless of how good the AHA is, it still does nothing to prevent production companies from shooting in another country with laxer laws towards animal use in films. Films such as Milo and Otis have been under debate for years regarding the safety of their filmmaking techniques, but without the information being made available and being overseen by multiple organizations, it can be hard to get clear answers. Ultimately, films need animals in them to help bring them to life. To create a film is to create a snapshot into another world, and a majority of the time that's going to include a dog or a cat, or a brigade of horses, or any other animal. But just because animals are considered property doesn't mean we should let harm come to them when it could easily be prevented. With the improvements of CGI like the recent Lion King, the case for using real animals on sets to perform dangerous stunts is growing smaller and smaller, at least in my opinion. I like dog movies. I like movies with animals, but I can't help but feel that vague sense of unease when you learn about something that happened behind the scenes that resulted in an animal's death, and it was preventable. Sometimes animals are going to die on set regardless of the conditions they're used in, but the lines continue to get blurrier and blurrier when consumers don't know who to look to when making sure the content they're consuming aligns with their own ethics. I'm sure most of us realize that PETA is basically a joke now. It gets harder to believe an organization totally devoted to animal welfare when they're criticizing Pokemon one day and acting as a legitimate foundation the next, and the AHA isn't all that different, unfortunately. If you've enjoyed any of the content on my channel and you haven't already, it would mean the world to me if you subscribe. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I'm currently at less than 100, so every single subscriber helps. Thank you all for watching this video. It was certainly quite a heavy one to make, and it ballooned the more it went on. Thank you all for watching once again, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.